gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to St. Luke. Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things they had seen. The Gospel of the Lord. Please be seated. I am often humbled by the people that Jesus chose to be his disciples. They are the most unremarkable lot of people you could possibly have found. They're peasants and fishermen. One guy's a tax collector, which in those days is not really a very nice person. And one's a zealot, which were a group of assassins. And so you look around at the people that Jesus chose and you wonder what he could possibly have seen in them. And as someone who's a minister of the gospel, I think that's what it says on my certificate anyway, I'm pretty sure that none of those guys would make it through the discernment process here in the Episcopal Church, which is also a bit humbling. And yet, when we look at what the apostles accomplished, these 12 unremarkable men did amazing and remarkable things. That they traveled the world, that they spread the gospel, that they were faithful, often even unto death, that they wrote these letters that we continue to read and discern, hear, and worship thousands of years later. There are many, many, many remarkable men who lived in the first century whose names we've never heard and whose writings we've never read. But these unremarkable men have had a lasting impact on the history of the world. And of course, the one that's most fully fleshed out in the Gospels is Peter. He's sort of the lead disciple, although Jesus seems to not really put anyone in charge. It's pretty clear that Peter has a leading role amongst the others. He's probably a little bit older than the rest of the group. I know in the paintings it always shows the disciples as being like old men with long beards, but in reality they were probably like young men in their 20s maybe. Maybe John was the youngest, it seems, and he was probably a teenager. And so these are young men who are being led by Jesus, who Jesus has seen the potential in. And when we see Peter is this, he's not an intellectual Peter, right? He leads with his heart, right? What do we say? His heart is on his sleeve. It's right out there in front. And whenever Jesus asks them something, Peter's always the first one to want to do it. When they see Jesus coming across the water, it's Peter who leaps out of the boat to try to walk to Jesus across the water, and he makes it 2 or 3 steps before he realizes he's walking on water and starts to sink, right? And when he gets worried about Jesus as they're on their way to Jerusalem, he tells them, we can't go because your safety is so important. And Jesus rebukes him a little bit, but then Peter kind of gets on board right away. And when they ask who he is, they tell Jesus, some people think you're a prophet, some people think you're Elijah, some people think you're John reincarnated. But he asks, who do you think I am? And it's Peter who answers first, the Lord, the Messiah, the chosen one of God. And once we've discerned that that's who you are, where else could we go but to follow where you lead us? And so Jesus comes to a point, he's about to enter into Jerusalem, and he goes up on this holy mountain, and he takes with him Peter and James and John, the sons of Zebedee, and they go to the top of the mountain. And of course, it's Peter who babbles something incomprehensible about building tents for everybody or something. And they see Jesus, and they see Jesus in a way they've never really seen Jesus. Now, they've kind of come to believe that Jesus is the Son of God, that he's the Messiah, that he's the chosen one, that he is going to deliver them into a new kingdom and a new age. But for the most part, Jesus is just like their friend, this man that they know, their teacher, their mentor. They've never seen him in anything like his true glory until they have this experience on the mountaintop. And they see Jesus in something like his heavenly form, dazzling white clothes, his sort of shining, transformed skin, and they're with who I assume they think is Moses and Elijah. I mean, I don't think they're wearing name tags or anything, but maybe Jesus told them later. But he's having this interaction with these other sort of fathers of the nation, and they see Jesus, and they're clearly affected by it, but they hold on to it until after the resurrection, when all the pieces begin to come together. And then we get this letter from Peter, which is probably written many, many, many years later, right? 30 or 40 years after the death and resurrection and ascension of Jesus. And he's talking about this experience he had as a much younger man and how it has framed and shaped his life of faith, but how he has understood and responded to that one experience he had so many years ago. And I think that's something really important for us, because for many people, their lives of faith unfold from a similar experience or some other sort of powerful interaction with the Holy Spirit in a way that we may never have interacted with them before. Right? Famously, there's Mother Teresa who had an experience when she was 14, I think a vision of Mary, and which propelled her to do amazing works and service. And what we know from her private letters is that she never had another experience like that for the rest of her life. And she lived to be into her 80s, I think. And that she longed for that experience, and yet she still continued to do her work even without it. And I've had an experience like that, and hopefully some of you have had an experience, hopefully all of you have had a moment of transcendence, maybe at church camp, or maybe in the Eucharist, or maybe in your baptism, if you can remember that, or the baptism of a child, or at the bedside of someone that you're standing vigil for. But hopefully all of us have had some sort of imminent experience of the Holy Spirit that we can hold on to, and that move us forward. And I think that if we have those experiences, if we can hold on to them, it can propel us into do amazing things like Peter did, or the apostles did, or Mother Teresa did. That it can move us into a place of ministry and mission, where we see the power and impact of Jesus on our own lives, and we yearn to share that transcendent experience of love out into the world, that it can propel us into amazing and fruitful ministry. And ministry is a somewhat unique endeavor among people, because people do lots of different things, and people do things that look like ministry but not necessarily are ministry. But when we, as Christian people, as followers of Jesus, take up the work that Jesus has given us to do, it's particularly unique because it's the only thing we do where we don't do fully by ourselves. That the Holy Spirit, that the Spirit of God is always a part of the ministries that we undertake. And whether that's a formal ministry through the church, or just something that we have committed to do in our own lives, when we partner with God, we can do far more than we ever expected or anticipated. And sometimes the work that we do is planting seeds that will bear fruit that we may not know about. Like when Peter wrote this letter, he's giving advice to a couple of people. And yet billions of people have read that letter and taken wisdom and encouragement from it. That when we partner with God, we do amazing things that sometimes we don't even realize how magnificent and impactful they are. That the things we do in partnership with God that we see over history have transformed the world. When we look at the lives of the saints and the holy women and the holy men who have passed through, even in our own experience, we see that their impact, what is it, how Jesus puts it? Sometimes 100-fold, sometimes 60, sometimes 30. That the things we do are magnified by the power of the Holy Spirit. And so I hope all of us, when we take up our lives of faith, that we search for the presence of God in our practices. When we come to worship, when we're in prayer, when we're studying scriptures, those are all ways that we encounter the living God. That Jesus Christ is someone who was executed over 2,000 years ago, but that we claim is risen from the dead and ascended to be with the Father. And so even to this day, at this very moment, as we gather together, Jesus is alive. He is in something like that transformed state that Peter saw a glimpse of at the mountain and that he experienced in the resurrection. And so for us, I hope the resurrection is a real living thing that changes how we see and interpret the world. That we see the world now through lenses of the resurrection, through lenses of God's love, through lenses of mercy and grace and humility. And that when we really, really hold on to this idea that at this moment, and at every moment in our lives, Jesus is alive. And through the Holy Spirit is with us forever. Even unto the end of the age is what Jesus promised, and we haven't reached that yet. And so through our lives of faith, we are given an opportunity to encounter this living God and to allow our lives to be changed and altered and to empower us, like the apostles, to do remarkable things. Amen.